everybody. This week I was given John Ashbery, and looking at him, I really started to think that this was going to be a situation of the Emperor's new clothes, given that there's a lot of great stuff about him. He's got a great reputation, but it is also dogged with this idea that people don't get a lot of sense out of his poetry. And so with that, I almost really feel like it actually says things to the point of, well, if we can't understand it, then of course it's great art for working with it. And I've been pleasantly surprised as I've gone through the stuff, researching things on this, that I have found that he really is kind of the real deal in some interesting ways. I struggled a little bit as to which picture that I wanted to use of his, and settled on this one, and I just really liked it because I think that we all deserve to have a moment of such bliss with a piece of cake. It'd make the world a better place. It'd be nice. All right, so getting into the introduction of that, on Poetry Foundation, Langdon Hammer said that no figure looms so large in American poetry over the past 50 years as John Ashbery. And if you're going by awards, then that is certainly true, because he has won tons of them. In fact, almost all of the sources that I was going for said that it started with, these are all the things that this man has won. Isn't that awesome? In fact, he started his career or getting into poetry by winning the Yale Younger Poets Prize, which was judged by W.H. Auden, and who later confessed that he had no idea what the manuscript was actually saying or what it meant. I guess he just liked it. And I feel like that has really kind of been the bit that has followed him through his career, that he is this giant, this literary giant in the American canon, but at the same time, he causes quite a bit of contention in how accessible his poetry is. But his work has been quite varied. For what his professional career was, he was a professor, curator, critic, produced over 30 books of poetry, including some trees. That was his first one, A Wave and Flow Chart. So getting into his poetry style, I found this quote and I really liked it, and I thought that it was good to show where his head was at when it came to his poetry, and that was that I don't find any direct statements in life. My poetry imitates or reproduces the way knowledge or awareness come to me, which is by fits and starts and by indirection. I don't think poetry arranged in neat patterns would reflect that situation. My poetry is disjunct, but then so is life. And it's interesting because he's got to be the most non-self-reflective poet I have come across about his work. In fact, looking at some of the interviews and things that he did, that I was doing for some research on this, that his response was more or less, I'm a poet, what do you want out of me, as it goes. In one interview, the interviewer started off with asking or giving a whole bunch of critical responses to his work. And that finished up with that I find his work annoying because it makes me feel stupid. And so that was actually his first question that he led with to Ashbery, saying, what is it about your work that makes people feel stupid? And what followed was a long and socially awkward and sort of painful explanation of his process and where he was coming from on things. And he stated it was about leaving a train station in Madrid, Spain. And he said that whatever it is, he doesn't think about the poem much anymore. It's been a while since he's read it. In fact, he recited it on the interview and said, it's been a few years since I've touched that one. But that he goes, I think I was just trying to get rid of something through the construction of that poem, and I did. So I don't think about it much anymore. And that most of his work was all based around similar things of what was he going through at that time, as he was trying to construct that and come up with representing the experience of life in the creative act. And that quickly turned into a pivot of that he finds expressing that difficult to people, and pivoted into the, so please don't ask me what my poems mean for the next bit of this hour interview. And that lack of self-reflection in it isn't necessarily that he doesn't have strong opinions on things or whatnot. In another interview, he was asked, it was pointed out that the public opinion on LGBT community and homosexuality in general is much more tolerant nowadays than in his youth, and that had it been more so in his youth, would his poetry be different? And he quickly quit his opinions that he didn't necessarily think public opinion was still so tolerant or good to that community, but then went into what some critics had proposed or thought that his homosexuality might have been trying to get through in his poetry. And I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's just not something he thinks about too much. It's not necessarily, I think, what interests him to there, which is quite neat. And gets into this final, or this other quote that I found of his, that he had a goal to produce a poem that the critic cannot even talk about. And that would be very pretentious, I think, in other terms. However, with him, I think it really is almost a defense mechanism where he is just, look, if I could create something that you guys didn't necessarily need to ask me about, then that would be great. That would just be awesome for it, which makes it a little more fun. So he was influenced by John Clare, Raymond Russell, and Laura Writing as well. That was what he had quoted in some of his criticisms. But however, probably the best tool that we have for cracking him open is his love of abstract expressionism as a painting style, as it gets into there. So when he was first starting his stuff, there was a painting revolution going on in New York in the late 1940s and 50s that was getting into this kind of an idea of that. He was a painter himself. A lot of his colleagues were painters or were also influenced by this, like Frank O'Hara. And I think what this really shows is that when you have an artist that is going across multiple mediums or multiple disciplines, that the concepts and the forms of expression can be exchanged through those, because he was a critic and a curator, not just of literary stuff, but also of paintings and art for that as well. So when we're looking at abstract expressionism, it really is non-representational perceptions of reality. It's much more about the event in that moment in time. And in fact, in some of my research, I found a great paper from Fred Moramarco. And in there, he had a quote from Harold Rosenberg that said, "At a certain moment, the canvas begins to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than as a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express an object, actual or imagined. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event." And Fred, in his paper, really starts talking about if you were to exchange some of those words in there, take canvas and make that the page, paint and make that words, and picture or portrait and change that to poem, you would really start getting into what Ashbery was hoping to achieve, or the way that he approached his poetry. Because for him, and he even said multiple times that he felt like anytime that someone read his poem, they were really just getting a snapshot of what was going on in his head and what that creative process was really like. And so to him, art is a captured moment of the artist. It is the taking you through the impetus of that creative act as it goes into it. And I think that that's really helpful when we're trying to look through some of his stuff and try to make sense of it, because that it removes the burden for you to have to try to think, well, what is this all about? That you can just sort of enjoy the experience of being able to go through that poetry, because chances are it's about something different than what you would imagine it to be anyway, as it is going to. Anyway, so tagging into that and bringing that back to Ashbery, and this really gets, again, back into that Emperor's New Clothes thing, because having received nearly every major award for achievement in the humanities, he continues to incite considerable debate as to whether his poems mean anything at all. And I found several instances where people were studying his poetry and felt that all of them were really more poems about poetry itself rather than some object or form of expression. And looking at what he himself had said, that he felt like he really wanted to get people to as close to the creative moment as possible. And we see this in some of his, and especially Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror, which is on 515 of our book. where he starts off by looking at a portrait, gets some ideas, describes it, getting into it, but then quite quickly he starts working off and starts describing these other thoughts and things that are coming up into his mind, and he just lets the poem flow over into what those things are and takes you along for that journey. He doesn't necessarily respects the form of what that poem might have been or to a single idea with it. Man doesn't necessarily have a train of thought so much as a boat that just goes off into more water to wherever he is, and that's fine because that's exactly what it is that he's trying to express. Again, bringing back to one of the interviews, that it was really just looking at him expressing the sensations of what that was like to leave a train station. Not because we need to meditate on the greater mysteries of what a train station has to offer, but he was taking you along onto what that journey or that snapshot of his own life was and how he was interacting with it. And that gets into what Mark Ford here said, because he was attaching him to Whitman and to some of Whitman's style, and that, like Whitman, it is essentially a means of involving the reader in the poem on what Whitman calls equal terms. And I really like this, and I think that that's one of the reasons why his work is accessible and why it is worth its spot in the canon, I guess. Not that I'm anyone who could judge that. But anyway, is the fact that we get to see art in a wildly different way with him, and that we get to see experience in a wildly different way. That I think a lot of times when it comes to poetry, that we presume that poets have some profound meaning or concept that they're trying to get across because they are that needs this elevated form, elevated language to get through. And that isn't necessarily, I mean, it is kind of the medium that he's working with, but it's not the goal that he's going to. But he wants to take you along that creative process and let you feel something. When you're looking at abstract expressionism, again, that's one of the things to it. You're looking at the event. What was that like to make it? What was the emotional truth that that's conveying to you, rather than the meaning that was meant to be expressed. So it gets its meaning in part by what you're bringing to it. And so it's a neat way of forming poetry, and it's a neat way of being able to look over the shoulder during someone's process with it. And that's one of the keys that we can look at when it comes to Ashbery. In any case, I hope that you enjoyed reading him as much as I did, and I will put my discussion prompts in my post. Thank you guys so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Enjoy the day.